welcome to Aesthetic Equity in Ensemble Theater. This is the FoolsFURY Build convening, and we are so grateful that so many artists have joined us for this conversation on aesthetic equity. Also, just a big, gigantic shout out to the person I got the word from. I attended a workshop that Paloma McGregor and Liz Lerman were running. It was, I believe, produced by Hope Moore Dance, and they introduced me to the term, and I fell in love with it. And then I took it and I stretched it and I used it and I gave it to other people, and we are using it. And I look forward to us using this term as a tool during the next hour. I also had the great privilege to work with Alison DeLa Cruz leading a conversation on aesthetic equity in New York in January when we were together in physically shared space. So it is an honor to continue that conversation with more of our field here in our digital space. Please take it away, Alison.
Thank you, Claudia. Hi, everybody. I'm seeing in the chat, a couple of people are having sound issues. Please keep articulating your issues in the Zoom in the chat. For those of you who are joining us in the live streams around the world, welcome. We're so excited you're here. We've been building a process together this morning as part of this build convening together. And as Claudia said, as members of the board of directors of the network of ensemble theaters, we have been developing conversations about how to help the field have these conversations so that we can not only surface kind of ways and tasks and things to do to change, but actually to manifest that change. So I want to acknowledge that if this is your first time in this conversation, I invite you to do your own self-guided learning around racial justice. And some of these conversations. I invite you to go to the resources on HowlRound and some of our other things that we will share in the chat. And I do want to also acknowledge and give the bump, as Claudia said, some of this conversation that I'm going to start us off today is certainly a deep nod to Paloma McGregor and Liz Lerman, and some of what I was able to see from Cherie Hill's documentation of that experience. So I'm going to share my screen with you and just get us started a little. We are going to share a little bit out from the groups that we had today at the build convening. So the first thing I would just want to say is, this is my first time playing a slideshow. Okay, so this is an aesthetic equity evolving conversation. This is by no means a definitive list. This is a beginning list. And this is, I want to give honor and say this is built on Paloma and Liz's work, but also the work of all the folks who presented today. I've been informed deeply by watching you and experiencing and listening and being conversation. I also want to start with this very first quote. If you saw the hype video that FoolsFURY posted, this is a quote from Claudia. And I can't seem to see it. So aesthetics are inextricably tied to justice. And when injustice is embedded in any part of the creation of the work, whether how much money people are getting paid to what ends up on stage, generally what we are getting is something that has less quality. But because we receive the product and the process is erased, and because the definition of what good is defined by those who dominate the field, we have trouble knowing what's good. To finish her quote, she says, "I'll be honest, I'm a Black woman, I know what's good." So we want to give love and acknowledgement to Claudia and say, yeah, we want to know what's good. We want to know how to use racial justice, to use justice-centered practice in moving our aesthetics forward. So as we think about aesthetic equity, some of the things that came up, these are big buckets. I have 4 big buckets today. Again, not definitive list, just a starter pack. We think about people. How is this labor happening? Is it paid or unpaid? How do people have access to this work, to make this work, to create this work? Who are deemed experts? That's a big conversation whenever we do different kinds of work. And who are paid experts, and who are experts that people get leaned upon because they're the homie or the friend or they're doing us a favor? Who are the creators of the work, not only in the room, but also who are the larger creators of the work that we're pulling from, and how do we make sure we honor those folks? Who are the participants in this work? Who is the audience for this work? And something that comes up again and again is, how do we deal with the multiplicity of people and not just see someone as a Filipino artist or a gay artist, but what does it mean to see our totality and our wholeness? And how, when we're trying to combat anti-Blackness in our spaces, how do we make sure to not erase Black people who are multiracial, like Black and Filipino, Black and Latinx, so that we're not, and that's something that I heard in that last panel, about how do we make sure everybody understands we're honoring all the multiplicity. As you think about aesthetic equity, I invite you to think about resources, space. How much space do you have? In this time of pandemic living, the assumption of space for people to create in their own home, how much assumptions are we making about how much space people have? What are the skills that are needed? What are the skills that we have to find? How much time is given to the process? How does time function in your process? In the resources, how does time function? Technology is definitely, as we continue to survive in these times, how does technology impact our abilities to create? And then just general stuff, right? Some people have lots of stuff that we need to make work, that could contribute to the work, as well as the money. And in resources, I also put administration, because I find that different companies and different artists have different access to administration, and that often impacts our ability to perpetuate or grow our resources, our money, or our time. I also invite you to consider aesthetic equity also in a big bucket of communication. What are literally the languages that are being used or expected in this process? What are the modes of communication? Is it all verbal or nonverbal? Is it visual? Is it movement-based? What is the frequency of this communication? If you talk to a partner at the beginning of your process and then you don't talk to them for 16 weeks and then you show up and you expect them to deliver for you, how did that frequency process work? What are the messages? There's a really great, I want to amplify, I was clicking around on the Latinx Theater Commons website, and that last panel that just happened recently about marketing folks in POC market, by POC marketing folks, talking about how messaging and marketing is actually a key place where a lot of companies miss opportunities for really looking at how we are messaging our work, and how that even the baselines of what gets set up actually creates barriers of access. Lots of conversation today in different groups about critique and scholarship of our work, of work in general, and the ways of knowing who decides what is good, how it gets talked about, where it gets heralded or not, and how much it gets held up or disappeared. And then finally, this last big bucket of process. As you think about the process in your aesthetic making, who has the decision-making power? As you decide about this work, what is the perspective or point of view that the work is taking? In the process of devising, who gets to devise? Are you using established forms, and what are the rules of those established forms? You can't just go in and pull an oli from a Hawaiian chant because you think it sounds cool, right? And then what are you doing in established forms? Again, thinking about experts and expertise. And then as you're thinking about hybridity, what are the conversations that you need to have about hybridity to honor all the different things? I also think about process in terms of time, space. There's no and to me, there is that time space together that is required to make the things we make. And then last but not least, certainly thinking about duration. What is the duration of this collaboration, this process? What is the duration of the relationship? Are you only engaging with people just because you have this one project and you need that one thing and then you're done? Or how do you create these long-term connective relational experiences? So just to say, the 4 big buckets: communication, process, people, and resources. And I can share this again, it's just a bucket assembly as we start to develop this work. I know that we had some folks earlier today in the build process. We went into anti-racist action circles. And so we had 2 different groupings, and I think one of the groupings also had some split outs. So often I feel like what happens in these spaces is that Black, Indigenous, and people of color folks are often invited to go first. So I kind of want to shift the paradigm and invite our anti-racist, our colleagues in the white community who are working on anti-racist practice, to share a little bit about what you all talked about as a way to allow the Black, Indigenous, people of color folks to respond and to be able to receive the gift of your work, and for us to know that you did work without us. So I want to give love, and I want to pass it over to Deborah, who is going to help us understand how that process went and navigate us to the next place.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much, Alison. Yeah, we were working without you because you don't need to be there. But what we're doing right now is going to share some of the outcomes or the action steps that are smaller breakouts. And they were pretty juicy breakout groups, like pretty small, which was lovely. And we had about 40 minutes to break apart the Tema Okun article that we were looking at about white supremacy and the vocabulary there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have, there's a few of us who are going to speak about just the actions, and for my fellow colleagues about to speak, just focus on your actions, I think, that your group wanted to commit to or lift up. And then I want to do a shout out to Schaefer's group. If somebody could put their name in the chat, who wouldn't mind reading the outcomes, because Schaefer won't be with us. If you are interested in doing that, then we can get you back on the document. So maybe Joshua, you can help support me in that, because I'm going to do my report back now. Awesome. Thank you. So in my group, some of the action items that came out of our discussion were about creating bridges, creating an intersectional listening circle with underfunded colleagues, and that is about funding and the funding processes. We talked a lot about, obviously, the bias of funding and the barriers to marginalized folks getting funding and centering them. So having an informal way for people to access knowledge, and taking into account learning differences and the way people communicate, which then then folks who do have more knowledge with how to write grants and how to get grants can then be education partners, and kind of help colleague to colleague, like apply for funding. Some things that came up is maybe an informal listening circle allows people to raise learning differences or access needs that like a guidelines and a foundation foundation website would never reveal. Next, we talked about an idea of the network of ensemble theater doing a call to action to funders to really hold them accountable to how we, and of course this work is already being done, but to be maybe more formal about saying, look, we need to change the way the funding happens, and we need to make it better for ensemble theaters. The languaging, you need to understand what we do instead of us fitting ourselves into like formats that are more mainstream theater, or that are just not, they don't work for the way that we make theater. Other things that we talked about were opening up physical theater spaces as a cultural hub to welcome diverse disciplines, and support individual artists, and also welcome different artists into your space as a form of inclusivity. We talked also about successful projects in the digital sphere, and how digital performance is a form of inclusivity and access action. So for example, Dragon Theater in Redwood City's online talent show nights are getting global participants and great attendance. And Deb Slater Dance is using their space as, they're working on getting, creating it as a video studio to give more access to people who want to create digital media. Lastly, we talked about disruption and better practices, things that we can do as white people. One is step aside. consciously recognizing our positional power and making space for others, and then making room for the value of lived experience of our colleagues, not just valuing like, oh, you have these many letters after your name. Co-learning rather than prioritizing some kind of educational background or training or something. And lastly, step up and speak up. And this is really important. White folks holding each other accountable for microaggressions and figuring out how we as a community can model disruption. So it's one thing to say, I really want to do that disruption. It's one thing to acknowledge that it's a microaggression. It's totally another to actually learn how to model the disruption, to include people and to hold people compassionately, and to manage the anger and discomfort in doing that. And then lastly, silence and the use of silence and not necessarily feeling like you have to fill the void all the time in meetings. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it to Joshua.
Okay, great. Great, and then I guess I'll pass it back to Anna. Anna's here, right? Great. So our group was focusing specifically on a sense of urgency and perfectionism. Those were the two things in the article that we really focused on. And we had a pretty in-depth discussion about both. And so we found perfectionism and a sense of urgency showing up in ourselves and our organizations a good bit. And here are some ways, and just focusing on what we're committing to do to disrupt these things of white supremacy culture. We committed as a group to thanking people for not being perfect and enjoying the creation, to model this idea in terms of counteracting perfectionism, model it right at the beginning, bring out the failures that didn't happen and make those successes in a way that we can learn from. Commitment to beyond a show, opportunities to learn from mistakes, forgiving ourselves for mistakes and forgiving others and look at what we can learn. Allowing different values and aesthetics in a group dynamic, not imposing our own ideas of perfectionism on others. Inviting dialogue about what the mistakes actually are, doing assessment, right? And really talking about it. So it's not so much about like, oh, this was wrong or right. The mistake is a new pattern. How do we define a mistake? And a successful experiment can happen even if it fails because it's done with integrity. That was something that we were saying, that if it's done with integrity, it doesn't matter whether it was a success or failure, or maybe those things don't even matter, right? This idea of mistake, is it a learning opportunity? So working with integrity, regardless of right, wrong, successful, not successful, that's what we're really working towards. We also addressed a sense of urgency, and this is what we committed to in terms of counteracting this, slowing down, prioritizing health and process for the group, giving agency and ability to slow down, allowing the group to voice needs and say this is unhealthy, like actually give the agency to the group to say this is an unhealthy speed or this is not working for us. Creating space for ritual, interrupting the culture of martyrdom, like the idea of I haven't slept in 2 days, we're not going to validate that. And hopefully we'll make more space so that we don't have to get to that point. Building infrastructure, asking for help, delegating, softening this sense of urgency. And then watching your own energy, monitor our personal tensions regarding time, and taking in group time, consciously into personal planning. That we might need more input than just, we're going to make a schedule, we're going to stick to it. How do we actually take in the time of the group, right? And cultural time within the group and make sure that it's one that values everyone. I'm going to pass it up to Anna on the sheet.
Hi, I'm Anna. I missed the intro, so am I just diving into the share? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. For forgiving my lack of perfection in the moment. Here you go. So the group that I was talking with, we did a kind of an embodiment of exercise with some of these these features of white supremacy culture and kind of got them in our bodies and saw how they were showing up. So there was some, and then how to counteract them. And there was some comments around the kind of stiffness and angularity that people were feeling in the kind of embodiment of these ideas, and then the kind of freedom and roundness and sort of slowness that people felt in a really great way when they released them. In specific, we were talking in particular a lot about the sense of urgency that was very common for many people in the group, came up a lot, as well as the perfectionism and this notion of I have to do everything myself. And so we kind of talked about those and pushed on them quite a bit. And we talked about how, the sort of challenge of disrupting these patterns, even if we're aware of them, when we are in a larger capitalist structure that is hard to work within, and that demands so many things from us, and particular issues around wages and time, and kind of how to balance time and wages and inclusiveness of lots of voices, and how we kind of find different ways of doing that. And then folks talked about just really trying to model the behavior of not doing these things, model the behavior of going slow, and just kind of trying to do that as much as possible, each of us ourselves, especially several folks in the groups are educators. And they talked about really trying to internalize different ways of being and model those with their students, and just really prioritizing taking time off and healthy schedules and self-care. And just to go and changing expectations around time and sort of meeting standards. Yeah, I think that was it. Thank you.
Brad, how about you?
Yeah, and first of all, I want to give a shout out to Anna, because we followed her suggestion of embodying these characteristics of white supremacy culture, and it was really powerful. People talked about how they found themselves doing similar gestures to each one, and how crushing it was to the spirit, and how it literally twisted our bodies. So that was an amazing way to enter into the discussion. We too focused on perfectionism and this sense of constant urgency, recognizing it in our organizations, our groups, and also in our own personal way of work a lot. And in terms of interrupting that with perfectionism, we were looking at, understanding that so-called mistakes are really opportunities for learning, and that we need to give ourselves that permission, and we need to give that to the people that we're working with as well. We need to interrogate who is setting the standard of perfection, and maybe the standard isn't actually valid. And we also, in this work, want to recognize that this idea of perfectionism can keep us as white allies from truly engaging in this anti-racism work, because of fear of making a mistake or being wrong in some way. And so it stands as a barrier for us in this work as well. And then with this sense of constant urgency, we were looking at ways that people are building in time for pauses and breaks into a rehearsal schedule, for instance, or a production schedule, literally building it in so that you've got time to reflect, you've got time to think and come back. So how are ways that we can do that? We recognize that there's a sense of scarcity that makes us think, oh, we can't either afford to do that, it's going to be costly, or we literally don't have the time. And we have to interrupt that sense of scarcity and allow ourselves this ample time for a break, to pause, to think, to go slow. And then the third, one is sometimes to simply question and interrogate the deadline. Is the deadline really a set deadline? Does it have to be that deadline? So those are some of the things that we looked at. I'm not sure who I'm giving it to next.
Center.
There you go.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, just so amazing to hear all the different directions and things that have been coming up. In our group, we talked a lot about how it's about how to transfer power rather than bringing in an artist as like a hired gun to make an organization feel, or the dominant culture feel like, oh, we've checked that box, we're supporting some of those, but actively shifting power and shifting the narrative into those people's hands, and bringing agency with engagement with new artists. We talked about using our skills to facilitate other people telling stories. Another, just, advocating for decentering our personal story and opening space for other stories. Talked about the relationship between artists and art making and the board, and making a rehearsal process that includes the board and that feeds a container that holds when the artists are gone. If the artists are just there for one project, how does that work also further the group as a whole, the organization as a whole? We talked about framing the conversation about what this job might be, making a connection between getting the best idea and getting better voices. And I feel like I can't quite remember the connection there, but that's what my notes said. And also advocating, personally, individually, when we're working in spaces with people of color, or especially in predominantly white spaces with people of color, that we as white people, as allies, can advocate for the people of color to be whole humans in a process, in an organization, and to speak up when we see activity or treatment that makes it seem like they're a check mark, or that they're not able to have that artistic agency and be a part of an organization. And even deeper than that, to interrogate our own organizations and ones we're parts of, interrogating why these new voices are in the room, what brought them in, and advocate for them to be, full humans and their voice to be heard. Reiterating, that liberation and accommodation is good for all of us. And then lastly, a really fascinating and deep just awareness that institutions need to be ready to redesign and transfer power and to adapt, and embracing that that adaptability and changing, and further releasing that idea of that there's one way or the wrong way, right way or wrong way, right? But that it's a constantly changing system, and to hold that openness, and that in that openness and access, trying to get more access for folks, we have to include the people who we claim to be serving. So just reiterating to include the people we claim to be serving in the design process, because that's really the only way that it's actually going to serve those people, rather than be a performative step of like, oh, look at we've created this thing. So thank you so much. I hope those regurgitations of really complex conversations made sense, and I'll pass it back to Deborah, I believe.
Yeah, Fenner. Thank you, Fenner. And Ryan Hill, our last report back.
And if there's anyone that wants to add from my group, from Schaefer's group, please do. We focused predominantly on the elements of time and of the need for comfort. Time came out in a bunch of different ways. I think Schaefer was the one that used a really great term, constructive discomfort, when he was talking about issues of bathroom rights, where the act of talking about it is a discomfort, and sometimes the act becomes purely about discomfort. And he talked about breaking that apart. We talked about that in terms of avoiding conflict, both in a power structure where you do not have that power, and in an older white guy's way, where if I talk loudly and aggressively, as I tend to do, I'm probably going to shut down some people unintentionally. So it's about adding filters between those observations, so you take the responsibility on yourself. And I think another great point that came up was flexibility with time. Some people have already mentioned a bunch of ways, taking breaks and things, making dinners for each other, understanding that if you're coming to rehearsal from your day job, let's embrace that shift we have to take together, make some dinner, sit down, break bread with each other, make the act of creation a more universal concept, not just rehearse. So that's a report out from that. Thanks.
Amazing. So that, thank you to all, that was 6 groups who shared. And just to say that I was tracking time. And then Lorenz, I don't know if I have to pin myself. This is Alison in the transition. So I just want to say thank you to those 6 breakout groups for sharing back your process. And I want to, so I want to acknowledge that we had in addition to those 6 breakout groups, we also had a group that was, we had the Black, Indigenous, People of Color group as well. And we offered folks an opportunity to split off, but most of that group decided to stay together. And I also just want to say that I hope that we can capture some of those notes so that white allies who were not in those circles could also benefit from that. I heard some really interesting and important and tangible things. And so now I just want to invite us to kind of breathe all those things in. I'm prepping the folks in the Black, Indigenous, People of Color room who we want to invite to share out. We didn't do formal asks, but as we remember when we left that room, we did ask folks to prepare to share. And Sam also has notes too. So let's go ahead and breathe in all that stuff that we just heard from our white allies about the work that they are doing and wanting to do as a way to unpack white supremacist culture. So I'm going to invite you to breathe all that in and exhale. Okay. All right. So we have that list of things that will be shared in the notes. And certainly that's not the only set of things. And now I want to invite folks from our Black, Indigenous, and People of Color group to share out some of the things that we talked about, that you talked about, and making sure that we have a chance to also share some of the learnings that we had. So I want to open it up to that group of folks and just invite that.
And this is Claudia speaking. As folks are queuing up to join us, please feel free to put your name in the chat. I know Sam had said that they had something to share. So yes to that as well. And of course, we're doing this beautiful exercise of accessibility and asynchronous accessibility. So we had group work where we left that exercise and we had good stuff for us. And now we're bringing it to this room to see if we can create some more good stuff for all of us. So I don't know if Eli is here with the amazing observations about cultural critics and criticism. There were some folks who had some really powerful stuff to say around economics. If anybody who was talking about that stuff wants to say what they said in the room, it was amazing. We did take notes, so we might also just repeat some of those really, really beautiful notes, but we'd love to hear the voices of those who worked with us. So please unmic yourself and start talking.
I'm just going to say we're making space for silence and that this might be a challenging moment for some folks culturally. I even had to fill it with this moment, so.
Well, I don't know how many people we had. Hey, this is Chris Jacob here. I'm coming from Detroit, land of the Potawatomi, and also many tongues, Detroit, Michigan. Yeah, I'm just going to try to articulate something that was said, at least one point that was said during our time there. And one big thing that came up was about the need of the critic. The fact that we often, due to the systems that be, we often go and lean into traditional critics to validate our work and to show our work as being worthy, and where that's really not the case, where we really need to dive deeper into the communities that we perform at and the communities that we perform for, and who we create work for, and how we're trying to move these people, and that they should be a part, community should be a part of the process from the get-go. So that includes, you know, possibly opening doors to allow people in the community to be coming in, especially white institutions that pop up and be like, hey, I'm new, I'm doing this, come see my work, where it's like really embrace the community that's there already, so they can be a part of the change, so they can be a part of the good that is being done, that a good that is hopefully being the intention behind it. Yeah, I don't know if Asia Dyer is here. She also brought up a really good thing that was about sometimes the work that we're called to do as BIPOC creators is often labor intensive, emotionally and spiritually laboring, and that you know, we need to have more room to the best of our abilities to allow for us, these creators, and for us to be able to create work that also reflects the other facets of us, that are not just the trauma, that are not just the pain, that is not just the ugliness, because we have so much to offer. And that should be included, and not just the commercially viable ugliness that we also have to be, that is also a part of life. Why not lean into the fanciful creativity that we all have? Yeah, I think that was at least two big points that stuck out to me during that time. Thanks,
Thank you so much, Chris. And just to share, thank you, Chris, for stepping up to that. Sam has also shared some of our notes in the chat for folks who are here in the Zoom. Is there anybody else from our group who wants to share a little bit about what you shared about, or some reflections from our group that you think would be helpful to not only the folks in the room with us, but maybe some of the folks who are also streaming online with us?
Hey, this is Dan Prixarnicle, he, him, his, calling in from the land of Volbancha, the land of the Choctaw and Homa people, creative producer for Monte Bazaar in New Orleans. And I think one of the big things that I was taking away from or thinking about is the idea of vertical and horizontal alignment. Taking a moment for all of our organizations before, like, you know, in terms of taking immediate action and just like assessing what is it that we have and how can we be realigning our resources from bigger institutions to smaller institutions and from like-sized institutions across the board. And how we can be intentional about that work, because it's just a shift of resource as opposed to needing more resource and working from that place of abundance. And making sure that we're also just kind of mindful of that fact of like not being in the scarcity mindset or not being ultra competitive and not siloing ourselves off, and figuring out what those systems could be. I think the network of ensemble theaters is piloting something like this already. So it's just this idea of like really just focusing back on alignment and resource.
Thank you so much to Sam for the note taking, because it's allowing us to asynchronously share some of those learnings. So I thought I would voice one of them, if that's all right. And also just shout out to Aja's incredibly good points, because our field makes a lot of money on trauma porn. Oftentimes you're in the room, and I have been in that season discussion where it was decided that the play that was a comedy wasn't deep enough, wasn't good enough. And we had to do the trauma porn, which meant if you were an actor of color, you only got to play trauma. Here is the note from Eli, however, that was worded so well, I wanted to read how they framed it. How do we foster community peer review? How do we abolish the hierarchy of traditional critic models? White critics often lack cultural competency to speak to nuances of the BIPOC experience. What other models might exist? Audience members are an integral part of theater making. How do we invite them in, extend the work beyond just the conventional theater space? The critic model is how the white supremacist culture works, reinforces specific white individuals making profit at the expense of the communities. And then there's a second note from Cynthia in the chat, but I think Cynthia might be here in the house if Cynthia wants to actually voice her own opinions.
Hi, I'm here. Hi, lovely. I love Claudia and Alison so much. Yeah, this comment, which I wrote in the chat, comes partially also from being like one of my hats I wear is as a scholar and the kind of ethics that I seek to enact when engaging in scholarship. So some of the questions I asked were how can so-called criticism be generative to artists and the communities that the work is meant for? How can that criticism be not like about evaluation and judgment and enforcing values of white Western supremacist aesthetics, but loving, culturally competent, personal and based in sustained, committed relationship rather than being a transactional, evaluative kind of exercise of power. Done.
Amazing, wonderful. Thank you, Cynthia. In looking at time, equity, and parity, we have about 6 minutes left in the share from the BIPOC community. Anybody else want to share something that you shared? Or I think dialect, you were also, I don't know if you're here in the, I see in Sam notes that we were willing to share.
Well, here's the beauty. I don't think dialect's in the house, but the beautiful thing is tomorrow, the entire conversation is on the racial equity divide. So we will be able to participate in the workshop that Pamela Capeland and Dialect will be holding. And I am excited about it.
Amazing.
I definitely am happy to jump in with two salient points that feel relevant from our big weaving conversation. For those that don't know me, my name is Sam. I use they, them pronouns. I am a producer, facilitator, freelancer, director, human in the world. I identify as mixed race, Black, brown, gender person. That like building off of some of what has already been said to the point of the critic, I think that the reimaginings that we're getting from Cynthia and that oh my God, where did you go, Jake? That Jacob had voiced. Also, one of the things that I feel we need more often to be willing to say is just to throw it out, just let it go away. What if we, instead of reimagining from a foundation that already exists, say, actually, this isn't something that's serving us, that is serving our community, that is serving an anti-racist, anti-oppressive journey and lens. So what if we just don't? The other point in terms of financial models and financial building is just, I think for me as a producer, like remembering to build, what if we just don't? Remembering to build in the monies for the work that you're talking about. Like when you are, if trauma, if what has to happen is a story of trauma, making sure that you're building in the finances to give your performers, to give your creators, to give your audiences access to the resources they need to deal with that trauma. That's also to say, when you're gonna ask for work to be created in this time, recognizing that not everybody has access to technology, not everybody has access to the internet, not everybody has access to make a video using the things they have in their house that's gonna be the caliber that $2, $3, $4 million theater wants it to be. So that theater needs to send me a ring light, send me a camera, send me the resources. And what does it also look like to think of those, the physical tools that we have in a kind of like co-oping manner? How do we share it? How do theaters open? Like theaters like there are whole buildings that are just shut down right now, that instead of me having to build a home studio in my very tiny apartment that has 4 people in it, it's not actually that tiny, it's good for 4 people. But instead of me building a studio, how can I book space in the theater that is not being used at this moment? What do all of those things look like? I will say, and all those things are realities. When I worked at TCG at the beginning of the summer, I was reimbursed for my internet usage for working from home. So just saying.
Thank you so much, Sam. And I really want to amplify and echo that, you know, all of these different pieces are part of things that we've discovered in the room together. I think things that we want to keep amplifying and saying to each other as a way for survival and a way for support in us being able to make this work. And remembering that, yeah, changes, if you do it the same way, of course it's going to go the same way, kind of thing, right? And in order for us to make a shift, we do have to literally make these different choices that lead to not only our own internal mental shift, but action steps. So in this last 11 minutes of this session, I recognize that time functions often in these processes, both dialogue-based processes as well as artistic making processes, that we wanted to use this amount of time left because we want to honor what's going to come after. And so what I want to ask folks to think about, based on what you've heard throughout this conversation, I want you to think about if there was one thing that you wanted to focus on in this next 6 months of your work in order to create more aesthetic equity in your work, in your practice. What is something that you want to do, are willing to do, are going to push yourself to do in order to move the dials in your world of aesthetic equity forward, or move the dial? I don't know if forward is the right word, but whatever motion needs to be made in your world, what do you want to do in this next 6 months? What do you want to do in this next year that is a tangible thing? And maybe part of it is you heard what folks shared out from the anti-racist white ally group. Maybe you've heard what the BIPOC folks have shared. Maybe it's something you've just come to because you've been in this build convening. Maybe it's something that's resonating for you based on things that have just kind of come up. So I'd love to invite us to take a minute of reflection. And I'm gonna ask you to, if you need to write, if you wanna move in your space. Often I feel in Zoom spaces, I'm not invited as a body to move around. And I heard that there was some movement that happened in other groups. So I'm gonna ask you to spend this next minute, keep yourself muted. To our friends watching in the live stream, I'm happy to be the picture if that's helpful. But I want you to think about, in this next 6 months, this is what I will do. This is how I will move towards creating more aesthetic equity in my work or in my artistic practice. So if you want to write about it, if you want to sing about it, if you want to dance about it, if you want to design a costume about it in this minute, whatever you need to do in this minute, I will time it. And while we wait, I will play a little song for us. How about that? So spend this minute thinking about, what are you going to do in this next 6 months? How can you be about action? And that's a cover of Joe Batan's Ordinary Guy by Toro y Moi, featuring the Madison 2. And I'll put that in the chat when I'm done. Shouts out to Joe Batan. So thank you. So let's spend this last, 7 minutes. I would love to see folks either volunteer to voice it, to show us in your screen your movement, or to drop words and verbals in the chat. What are you going to do in this next 6 months to advance, amplify, solidify our aesthetic equity in your practice, in your process? Thank you, Susan, for starting us off. Working smarter towards dismantling my need for perfection, expanding how and who I gather information from. Natalie's going to ask tough questions, even though I may fear the answers. Deborah wants to work with other white people to model disruption. Wiley wants to work to dismantle scarcity mindset as it relates to time and resources. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing folks' names. Katrina's got really clear and organized documentation about expectations and processes. Someone else might want to voice.
Yeah, I wonder if we want to be a little wild and crazy. Unmic yourself. Let's hear your voices. Let's see what happens. Go for it. Just say it out loud.
I've got one.
Go.
So I got a whole bunch of potential collaborations going, and the thing that I got moving was to take the option that feels like it's pushing me from behind, right? So I'm not going to use my head. It's just the one that feels pushing, but also the one, because I was swinging my arms and then they went farther than I thought they could go. So take the option that feels like it's swinging my arm farther than it can go. And within the context of some things that I love, invalidating perfection, interrupting I don't have time and I don't have money. I really like interrupting scarcity, and I really, really like constructive discomfort. So constructive discomfort in how I'm creating things in context of what I'm willing to say to the white community, but for me, in how uncomfortable I'm willing to go into the conversation with people whose culture is beyond what mine is. And especially doing that with some of my collaborators who are not a bunch of white people. Really amazing artists, just going there with them together.
Amazing. Someone else want to voice what you want to do in this next 6 months?
I'm Sierra, and I'm working on I had a one-woman show, and I'm working on turning it into a TV show, and it's satire. I'm kind of like a Fox News white woman lady. And I have a lot of BIPOC people working on the show, and I really want to focus on making sure that they have the opportunity to do whatever they want in the show, but also to really express a lot of cultural joy alongside other kind of like harder issues that are a part of the show, and being really conscious about like balancing or even maxing out more on the joy portion of like that presentation in media, and also being conscious of like my need to do all the work myself so I don't feel like I'm putting that on other people, and like inviting them to participate as much as anyone working on the show feels possible, and to compensate that as I can.
Somebody else want to voice or share a movement about what you want to do in this next 6 months? Amazing things are also popping off in the chat.
I'll voice mine. I would like to facilitate some experiments with food, feeding people and creating space. To experiment.
Thank you.
Nutrition before creation. Feed your community, feed your collaborators. Make sure you're all fed before you start moving.
I would like to make one comment. It really struck me when you talked about, I'm sorry, I think I am A.C. Harvey. Yes. And it was a comment about the critic and critique. And the comment was that the critic, we may not need a critic in the standard sense. Instead, what would it be like to turn to the audience? The audience is already diverse, and ask them all to think of themselves as critics, just as an experiment, and invite an entire audience to write critiques of a particular show or performance, and then see what comes out of that, because they may have other guidelines, other things to look at, other points to be made, And we could learn a lot from that groupthink about the idea of the critic, who is an arbiter of taste and whatever. If we don't think of it only as consumer information, but of something else that is aesthetic, then invite the audience to be participant.
Thank you so much. And I see, and I heard this too, AC, as you shared that some folks may not already have diverse audiences. And then my other thought after that is like, yes, being in diverse audiences, I know all my diverse audiences have opinions because I can hear, because they will express in those ways. And so what does it really mean to empower those opinions and allow them to chat in your Zoom performance and really critique as they go? And how does critique show up culturally in communication ways that are not always in print? So thank you for opening that up. I want to acknowledge we're in the last few seconds, and I want to notice that the last several folks who've shared have been, in my understanding, look white. So I want to invite if there's any other opportunity for BIPOC folks who want to share. And if I misread you as only white and you're mixed like me, I acknowledge that too.
Actually, this is me being wild. May I voice a comment that's from the chat that's in the Hopin too? Because y'all, there's like, I don't know how many of us that are in here, but there's like an equal number of people that are in the Hopin too. And I don't know how many folks are in or watching from the HowlRound. I love how we're in multiple spaces. So this is from Jackie Rivera. As a white Latinx theater maker, investing in my cultural competency and setting in motion the work I've been contemplating around my marginal experiences. In addition to that, recommit myself to organizing a white passing Latinx affinity group to talk about colorism and invest in our Latin cultural work and communities and divesting ourselves from fitting in and keeping up white-centric stories and work. We don't have time for me to read all of the comments that are in the Hopin too, but y'all are doing the work.
Thank you for giving us trans platform experiences. Yes. Because not everybody can jump screen to screen, so platform to platform, so thank you. Somebody else who wants to amplify either something you're seeing in the Hopin chat, in this chat, something you want to say, something you see in the notes, something that's occurred to you, a droplet of wisdom. How do you want to spend this next 6 months?
I'll jump in. 2 points. I'll just go off of one of the two things that was just said by you, Alison, and Claudia, reading off from the Hopin of like, finding some other mixed race folks that have maybe visually ambiguous identities for others that can't read them, and try to make this third space of what is allyship and labor and disruption for that specific group is something that I want to work on in the next 6 months, as well as move towards participatory and relationship focused budgeting within our ensemble.
Amazing. Thank you, Shireen. I want to acknowledge that I also want to spend the next 6 months trying to find ways to create compassionate ways to acknowledge expertise in communities of color and Black and Indigenous communities as well, because I have found as a non-degreed expert that my expertise is often overlooked and not proven, even though I know the ways of proof have actually manifested in my life. So I'm curious about how to connect to other non-Western degreed folks about expertise. Someone else? Last 2 comments. I'm trying to get us to that art share so we can create continuous aesthetic equity in the sharing of the work that's coming. And there is a digital altar. Yes, I'll stop. Who's that? Go, Dan.
Sorry, Dan, Mondo Bizarro. I think the one thing I really want to focus on that's like direct is creating a micro residency program within the next 6 months to directly support, to directly support artists now for development of work, and like use what, what considerably small resources Mondo technically has, but what's the meaningful amount of money to continue to share the space that we're stewarding and also get direct funds for artists to create and develop work now.
And I appreciate the voices of little people and the making that happens on a daily basis in the mind, body, and spirit of little people. And I'm gonna offer this last thought. So wherever you find yourself, I want you to think about, what are you taking away from this conversation? What have you been energized by? And then I also want to invite you to discover, what are you critiquing? What was missing? Did you have judgment about how people did or did not participate? Do you have judgment about how much time we had today, right? And I want to invite you to remember that, as is the case in all of our work, we are the makers of the thing, and that you have the opportunity presented before you to find the tools necessary to move yourself and your practice and the community of people you want to engage with. You have an opportunity to move that forward, to push that dial, whatever direction, up, down, left, right, forwards, backwards, diagonally. So I do want to invite that. We will post these things. And then the last thing I want to say, my participation is not only as an alum of this festival, which I'm super grateful for, but also as a board member of the Network of Ensemble Theaters. And at this time, NET wanted to make sure that it is accessible to the field. So if you have an interest in NET, you've never really heard about us, you've kind of heard about us, and maybe finances are a thing that are getting in the way because resources are real, and you want to join this conversation with NET, come visit our website, find out more about the Network of Ensemble Theaters, and join us in this period in the time and place that you can. I want to say thank you so much to Deborah and Claudia and all of the folks at FoolsFURY right now. Thanks to Lorenz and everybody behind the scenes of the tech. And one last thing, I just want to invite you to breathe in all this goodness. Let it energize you. Let you restore the knots and the holes and the yeah. And if you haven't stood up or bent over or done something different, change your physical position. And I invite you to take one last big breath in and a big breath out. And I thank you so much. And I send you all so much love. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Alison de la Cruz, for guiding us through this work. I just keep calling it work and labor. I keep thinking this is the factory where we're rebuilding a field where we're doing things that don't hurt and harm us all the time. It's so deeply exciting to be in this space with you all. Thank you for your ideas. Thank you for your smart ideas. Thank you for your beautiful content and your vulnerability and the work you did before entering this space and now. We are now transitioning into our final art share of the day. So excited. Deborah, are there anything else I should tell audience members before we get into the art shares?
No. Do you want me to give them what we're going to see now before we go over there? Or?
Sure, go right ahead.
Oh, I'm so excited, y'all. We have such a great lineup of folks. We're gonna hear from Julius Ria, Kieran Bessia, the Forum Collective, local to Bay Area, Zach Jaffe, Zide Pietro Jerry Soto of Teatro Theater Group out of New York, and then Anita Marie Holland, Rebecca Wright, Applied Mechanics. So it's gonna be super uplifting. Just jump into your hop-in, and we're gonna go there right now.
So in this moment, our audience members that are inside the Zoom with us that we're doing aesthetic equity are now returning to the Hop-In 2. They're returning with their other audience members. I see their numbers growing, and we are now about to enter the art share. Shout outs to my audience watching from HowlRound. Shout out to my audience from Facebook. Shout out to the audience inside Hop-In 2, and thank you to the audience inside the Zoom. Big shout outs to Lorenz, to Sabina, to all the interns, to Kadar, who is doing amazing work, making this all look smooth and beautiful. Thank you, Sam, for helping us in this session. Thank you all for being here. Low key, I am stalling for time a little bit as we transition. It does take a little bit of time for folks to enter and exit the digital space, and we just like to make sure we are allowing people to fully arrive so they can audience and really enjoy the work accessibly. Looking forward to that.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Claudia.